Religion, a cultural phenomenon where people of the same faith can find a belonging with people of the same beliefs. Film, a cultural phenomenon where people can find belonging in a mutual appreciation borderlining on a religious obsession of a piece of work.
According to Taib Osaifi, a graduate of Higher Institute of Applied Studies in Humanities, biblical messages marked the golden age of American film during the turn of the 20th century.
He wrote an article on Medium.com where he describes the representation of religion in American movies during the turn of the 20th century. In the article, he describes how there's an oversaturation of biblical messages in movies aimed towards Christian audiences.
He writes that ever since the cultural introduction of moving pictures during the early 20th century, American movies used religion and religious themes to in many ways shape the industry. Movies such as The Life of Moses from 1909, From the Manger to the Cross from 1912, and the trilogy of Ten Commandments, The Sign of the Cross, and The King of Kings from 1923, 1932, and 1927 respectively,
all show the early era of moving pictures' fascination with biblical stories. But, as we all know, during the 30s and 40s, the world was stirred up by uncertainty. And so, my question at issue is,
how were movies depicting religion during the post-war era? More specifically, I want to take a closer look at the years between 1945 and 1960 to see movies' representation of religion.
Now, obviously, I can't watch every single movie released between 1945 and 1960,
but a quick search found me 2 movies that piqued my interest. I am going to focus on the European versus the American movie industry, as they were the most prominent scenes, as well as the fact that it more easily will allow me to compare the religious themes.
The Seventh Seal is a movie by the famous Swedish director Ingmar Bergman, and it was released in 1957. The Ten Commandments from 1956 was made by American producer and director Cecil B. DeMille, who also directed a version of the same story in 1923.
I chose these 2 movies because they are close in time proximity, and will also show how the religious representation was different between the USA and Europe.
Before I jump into analyzing these 2 movies, however, it's quite hard to discuss this question without also bringing up the Hays Code.
Once again, thanks to our buddy Taib, in his article on Medium, we can read about the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as Hays Code. Taib writes that the code puts a censor on 3 specific topics. These topics are sex and profanity, criminality, and of course religion. The code, according to Osaifi, meant that satire and twisting on religion in any shape or form, and representing religious figures as comical characters, was prohibited. This led to a decline in religious movies and religious themes altogether.
Exploration about the issue where religion and society could affect each other sort of vanished from movies until the Hays Code was abolished in 1968.
Now, the code didn't completely stop religious movies, of course, and there were still ways to create criticism through drama. Jake Hinkson, a film scholar, writes in an article on criminalelement.com about the movie Edge of Doom from 1950, in which the audience is asked by the director to sympathize with a murderer who kills a priest. Hickman also writes about the movie The Night of the Hunter from 1955, in which the director, Charles Lawton, was able to criticize religious authority without criticizing the idea of belief in and of itself.
Figured I was gone.
Run, hide in the staircase. Run quick.
In an interview, Lawton had said that adapting the movie from its original novel, quote, was a marvelous opportunity to show that God's glory was really in the little old farm woman and not in the Bible-tooting son of a bitch. The reason I brought up Hayes' Code is so that we can look at the movie The Ten Commandments through the lens of the code and analyze what in the movie could have been changed and still kept the movie within the confines of the code's rules.
Since the movie The Seventh Seal isn't an American-made moving picture, it doesn't have any codes to really follow.
Short background for the movies. The Ten Commandments take the story of Moses and dramatizes it. The books Prince of Egypt, Pillar of Fire, and On Eagle's Wing are attributed writing credits, although the story of Moses can be found in the Exodus in the Bible.
The Seventh Seal is about a knight who returns from the crusade during the Black Death.
The knight has lost his faith and tries to understand what his purpose in life is. Just in this short summary, we can see that both the movies have strong religious connections. Now it's just up to us to see how these movies represent religion. Before the Ten Commandments starts, Cecil B. DeMille, the film's director, enters the stage and gives an explanation about what is going to unfold on the screen. He tells the audience that the film's theme is whether man should be ruled by God or a dictator like Ramses, if the people belong to the state or if they are free individuals under the power of God.
The theme of this picture is whether men are to be ruled by God's law or whether they are to be ruled by the whims of a dictator like Ramesses.
We can already tell from the way Cecil puts this that the movie won't discuss the actuality of God and his existence, but rather question if God has authority over man.
Are men the property of the state, or are they free souls under God? This same battle continues throughout the world today.
If you analyze his introduction further, we can see an anti-communist message in the way he specifies people being owned by the state rather than having their own free will given to them by God.
Communism was regarded as Christianity's biggest threat, as stated in a sermon by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in 1953. Although the movie is about the birth of Judaism, there is no question that when Cecil speaks about the battle that continues today, he's talking about the Christian land of the free versus the state-owned communists. 10 minutes in, we get our first interaction with Pharaoh, Ramses I.
I number my enemies by their swords, not by their chains, High Priest.
Chains have been forged into swords before now, Divine One.
He is being addressed as the Divine One, showing how the Egyptian faith can put the pharaoh on the same pedestal as a god. 5 minutes later, Bithia, daughter of Pharaoh and soon to be the mother of Moses, ascribes the blessing of a baby boy to the Nile god.
The answer to my prayers.
You prayed for a basket?
No. I prayed for a son,
Your husband is in the house of the dead.
and he has asked the Nile god to bring me this beautiful boy.
These two instances early into the movie show us the polytheism that was a part of the Egyptian culture 1200 years BCE.
How many more days and nights will you pray?
This faith of theirs can be seen as a sort of nature religion, as my own religion teacher pointed out during a lecture on the 7th of October 2020.
I have raised my voice to you, yet life has not come to the body of my son.
Further proof of this nature religion comes in the form of Nefertiri, throne princess, referring to Moses as a god.
Who is this fair young god coming to the house of Pharaoh?
Obviously, in the eyes of the Hebrews, there are no gods other than the God of Abraham, and the fact that the deliverer, Moses, is able to save them from slavery is this movie's way of saying that there truly is only one God worth worshipping.
Listen to Moses! He speaks God's will!
This point is made clear towards the end of the movie, after Pharaoh Ramses II already has set the Hebrew people free. He starts to undermine his own beliefs when the god of death won't resurrect his son after the 10 plagues.
I cannot fight the power of his God.
His God. The priests say that Pharaoh is a god, but you are not a god. You are even less than a man.
Other than Ramses, we also see how his advisors and military generals lose their faith, as they are scared of the God of Abraham.
Oh, Great One, let his people go, for all of Egypt will be barren from the cataracts to the sea.
Before Ramses' decision to set the slaves free, all of the nobles and advisors in his upper circle advise him to let them go before all of the firstborn die.
We fear no army of the earth, but can we fight plagues with swords?
There is no shame in this.
Ramses, however, tries to explain the previous plagues with facts and logic. He is ultimately proven wrong when his and all the other sons die of the 10th plague.
Was it the wonder of your God that fish should die and frogs should leave the waters? Was it a miracle that flies and lice should bloat upon their carrion and spread disease in both man and beast? These things were ordered by themselves.
All of this is a pike towards the idea of other gods than the one of Abraham. It's even the first of the 10 commandments to not have any other gods other than him. It's, however, not only the Egyptians who get to feel the wrath of God during the movie. Meet Dathan.
You're Dathan, the Hebrew overseer.
Dathan is a Hebrew who plays with his own people's lives. He is the chief Hebrew overseer, whose job is to make sure that the slaves work as hard as they can.
Rely on you to sell your own mother for a price.
This gives him a bad reputation with the worker Joshua. Dathan bargains with Ramesses and sells his own people by telling the Egyptians that Moses is the deliverer.
The deliverer is Moses.
This shows that he himself is not a religious man, but rather a selfish man who only seeks out power to help himself. By selling out Moses, he also gets his freedom, wealth for life, and a wife who is actually in love with Joshua.
The angel of death may pass you by.
Once Pharaoh releases the slaves, Dathan is forced to leave with the Hebrews, which leads to him trying to wager against Moses. He preaches against Moses when they are faced by the sea with an army behind them. Dathan blames Moses for leading the people into a death trap.
He's a false prophet who delivers you to death. Stone him! Stone him!
Joshua stays on Moses' side, and Moses then divides the sea so that they can all escape. Once the people reach the Sinai mountain and Moses go to receive the 10 commandments, people in general begin to feel cheated.
Could anyone live on that fiery summit for 40 days and 40 nights?
Moses is on the mountain without being able to signal to the people down by the foot of the mountain. This leads to the people starting to riot, and Dathan tries to convert the Hebrews to the nature religion. Once Moses comes back down from the mountain, He sees the havoc and gives the Hebrews a chance to prove that they are truly faithful to the God of Abraham.
Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me.
Dathan himself decides to disown the God of Abraham. Moses then opens a rift in the ground. This rift is filled with fire, and Dathan, together with other non-believers and idolaters, fall down to the pit of flames, which in my mind is a very obvious metaphor for the pits of hell. Joshua, a man who throughout all this time believed and followed Moses, came through the entire ordeal unscathed. After the ordeal by the Sinai mountain, God made the Hebrews walk through the wilderness of the desert land for 40 years, so that all of those participating in the evil by the foot of the mountain would perish. Joshua and his wife are still there by Moses' side, showing how a life in utmost faith brings prosperity to the pure.
Joshua, I charge you and strengthen you, for you shall go over Jordan to lead the people.
The entire movie revolves around how one true faith will keep you safe from the wrath of God, and how false gods and beliefs send you down the path of anger and hate. Those who defy the laws of God end up suffering in many different ways, and in the end, it is those who follow God's law who conquer. The consensus of the movie falls in line with what was typical for movies and television during this time in America. In an article named Popular Culture and Mass Media on the website legacy.cnx.org, we can read about the values which moving pictures tried to reinforce during this time period. Patriotism, anti-communism, and faith were amongst the most important and common subject matters where values were conformed to the general consciousness. And in general, people were scared of the Soviets, and they went to church every Sunday. It's not surprising that this movie, as well as Cecil's speech before the movie, both conforms to these beliefs. Never once during the movie does Moses question his Hebrew heritage. There is almost no inner turmoil because he accepts his place under God quite instantly after being told he was born a Hebrew.
I am your brother Moses.
The 1998 movie, The Prince of Egypt, actually explores this turmoil in a more realistic way, which actually would have been allowed under the Hays Code, which means that Cecil left out this turmoil on purpose. The movie is trying to make Moses seem like an honorable and faithful man, but like in the movie The Prince of Egypt, it would make more sense to have him question and ponder his heritage before accepting his role as a shepherd of God. The movie is also a simile for the American Christianity versus heathen communism, further reinforcing that the followers of one true God are free, whilst those following false gods are being ruled by one man, Pharaoh. During the picture, we also get to see the power of God and his kindness in how he saves the Hebrews and allows them to follow him even after they betray him at the foot of the Sinai mountain.
We do, however, see a change of perspective in the Seventh Seal. The Seventh Seal begins with a view over the sea and a beach.
In the background you can hear a few notes of the Dies Irae, a song which historically has represented death in movies, according to Music Bachelor Sideways on YouTube. This movie in general has a lot of subliminal religious messages and some more obvious depictions, but it all revolves around death. The knight Antonius Block went on a crusade for 10 years. When he steps back on land in Sweden, he is put face to face against death.
Vem är du? Jeg døden.
Death scares him. Antonius doesn't want to die, or rather, he's scared of what will happen next, after he dies. You see,
Antonius, despite being on a crusade, has lost part of his faith.
Antonius challenges death to a game of chess to extend his time on Earth to try and find answers. Antonius searches for these answers on his way back home to his wife, but on his journey, his following grows from only himself and his squire to a group of 8 people. In a church on the way, he makes a confession to a priest. He starts his confession by explaining how his heart is empty on the faith and love for God. He explains that he cast humans aside for his love of God, which now has led him to be an outcast, and believes that his faith was only dreams and imaginings.
Numera lever jag i en spökvärld, innesluten i mina drömmar och fantasier.
It's here where he also explains that he wishes for death and knowledge.
Jag vill ha vetskap.
He feels cheated by God, knowing that he spent many years of his life in dedication to this power, which never shows himself and hides in the clouds. He cries that he wants to evict God from his heart, and yet he wants to believe, because he knows that he is going to die, but he doesn't know what is going to happen to him after death. Antonius hammers home the idea of liberalism, where he doesn't want to bear the chains of faith, but rather feel the freedom of knowledge. He believes that knowledge is what will set him free from the pain he suffers.
Vi måste göra oss ett belet av vår rädsla.
Finally, he explains that his reason for playing chess is to perform one meaningful deed before his death, as he feels he has wasted his life searching for something that might not even exist.
Den fristen ger mig tillfälle att uträtta ett angeläget ärende.
Antonius questions his faith so much that he is willing, or rather wishing, to remove God entirely from his heart. What he didn't expect, however, is that he would meet with the jester Joff. Joff has a wife and child. They are traveling and performing plays and music shows. Joff has an unusual ability to see divine spirits. He is able to see the Virgin Mary with the Jesus child early in the story. And when Antonius plays chess versus death, Joff sees death and fears for his family's life. Once he realizes death is around the corner for Antonius and his following, Joff decides to run away with his family, inevitably leading to them surviving the Black Death. Unknowingly to Antonius, this is the final deed, the one good deed that he wished for. The question is, was it God's power that put them together? Was it God's will that Joff could see divine spirits? And was it God that allowed Joff and his family to ride away into a storm just to survive? The cause for most actions is left ambiguous. It could all be dumb luck and intuition, or it could have been some kind of divine intervention that allowed for all of this to unfold. Either way, Antonius finds his wife, and together with his following, they all share a meal with death.
This story in general is hard to describe.
There are parts where we believe God intervenes for marvelous effect, but there are scenes where worshippers are being enslaved, women burnt, and priests abusing their power. Joff is never seen truly worshipping God, and yet, if you so will, a divine intervention saves him and his family from the plague. The story shows that in many ways, that worshipping might not be the absolute solution, and God will use his power for those he deems worthy, whether or not in their hearts truly have faith. With Antonius, it's the same deal. His one wish, in a way, was fulfilled. He was able to help the family on the journey, and once it was time for them to leave, he indirectly, by playing chess with death, made Joff leave with his family. This film really shows a sad reality of God. He doesn't always show himself or come to those begging for it, but rather manifests in small unseen deeds which can affect people's lives in ways way larger than perceived. The story also shows how in search for knowledge we can find what is the most important to ourselves, and the answer or solution we are looking for might be inside ourselves and not in hope of God.
Jag vill ha vetskap. Inte tro, inte antaganden, utan vetskap.
The important thing to look at is that the movie never looks down on or frowns upon faith or gods. It merely depicts a version of faith where maybe God isn't the center of it all, but maybe true human interaction and satisfaction is what truly heals people. The seventh seal shows that God's power might not be in the mystical wonders performed, such as dividing an ocean or sending plagues on Egypt, but rather in finding friendships and mutual trust in one another, and not feeling offended or hurt by someone growing past yourself.
What I find truly interesting by these two movies is how they both are works of their time and region.
Comparatively, The Seventh Seal is nuanced and questions many of the things taken for granted in many world religions, while the Ten Commandments shows the power of God as a truth of which we should worship. The Ten Commandments also is referring to current events, such as the Cold War through its interpretation of America versus the Soviets. The Seventh Seal focuses more on the personal aspect of the story, where the actors and setting could have been almost anywhere, with any people, with most religions, and still could have made a coherent point throughout. I believe that Cecil could have done more to expand the contrast between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, based on their religious beliefs. I believe that the nuance was lost in the character of Moses, which could have enhanced the emotional impact on his decision to denounce the nature religion and choose his heritage over the built-up trust between him and his adoptive family. This is something that, in my opinion, the Seventh Seal does better. The nuance in the main cast of characters shows not only who they are, but it tells why they are, from where their decisions come from, and what previous interactions have done to form them as people.
Vi hade det för bra. Vi var förnöjda. Herren vill tukta vårt belåtna högmod.
Their faith doesn't define them as characters, but rather in an extension of what and who they are, which makes it less obvious to analyze the actual religious messages in the film, but it does, in my opinion, make it more interesting.
The story of Moses is part of the Exodus, which means that religious depictions come naturally. The movie, however, does actually do a good job at representing the idea of religion and the way Americans viewed it during the 1950s.
The story that Cecil wanted to spread is one that most Americans could identify with, whilst Bergman took more creative liberty with his depiction of religion.
Bergman's depiction of religion doesn't even include a god, but merely the idea of God.
Isn't the lack of God in one story also a depiction of faith? Could it be that in not showing God in any shape or form, but only through actions completely explainable with logic and science, that Bergman shows how God is a man-made delusion to satisfy our need for knowledge?
Or is it that faith is a mix between our heritage and a faith shared between a certain amount of people?
Could it be that in allowing God to have a presence in one story, that Cecil shows us that there is a divine power with a plan where everyone has their own part to play?
Religion. Deceit or enlightenment.